They say Mother's Day is the one day a year every mother should feel loved, honored, and remembered. I used to believe that too. This past Mother's Day, my son invited me out for brunch. The restaurant was lovely, the kind with soft jazz playing overhead and fresh tulips on every table. I wore the pearl brooch his father gave me on our last anniversary, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would be a day to remember for the right reasons. After the eggs were cold and the coffee had long gone bitter, Adam smiled and handed me an envelope. I smiled back, expecting a card with scribbled love from my grandchildren. But when I opened it, there were no kind words. No, thank you for raising me. Or, we love you, Mom. Just a bill. He had itemized the entire meal and circled my portion in red ink, along with a note. We all split equally, Mom. It's only fair. That moment didn't shatter me. Not quite. It was more like a quiet cracking deep inside, a seam giving way after too many years of bearing the weight. It wasn't the first time Adam had disappointed me, but it was the first time I realized I had allowed it for far too long. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I folded the bill neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and said, "Thank you. That's very clear of you." But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this mother still had one final gift to give, and it wouldn't come in an envelope. My name is Ruth Miller. I was 42 when my husband Harold passed away from a heart attack in our backyard while mowing the lawn. One moment he was waving at me from behind the screen door. The next I was dialing 911 with shaking hands and a scream lodged in my throat. We had been married for 21 years. Adam, our only child, was just 10 at the time. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I had to keep going. For Adam. I took a second job sorting inventory in a freezing warehouse on the edge of town. In the mornings, I delivered newspapers on my bicycle, even through snowstorms so fierce they erased the sidewalks. I'd come home with frozen fingers and a back that felt twice its age, but I never let Adam see that. He needed shoes, he needed textbooks, he needed hope, and I was determined to be that hope. I learned to stretch every dollar like dough. I patched his jeans with fabric from old curtains, skipped meals so he could have seconds, and turned off the heating when he wasn't home. For 5 years straight, I didn't buy a single new dress. I wore Harold's oversized flannel shirts and pretended they were enough. I took out a second mortgage to pay for Adam's college tuition when he got into the University of Michigan. When the first acceptance letter arrived, I cried so hard I had to sit down. I remember thinking, we made it. Harold, we really made it. I mailed off the first check the next day. Adam didn't let me attend his graduation. He said the ceremony was overcrowded and that he'd send me photos. I never got any. I told myself it was just how kids are. They get busy, they move on. But that day, I sat in our living room in the same dress I wore to Harold's funeral, holding a bouquet of carnations I'd bought for myself. I stared at the wall and whispered, "We're proud of you, sweetheart," to no one but the dust. Adam graduated with a law degree and a job lined up at a mid-sized firm in Chicago. He moved into a high-rise apartment overlooking the river and started sending me polite, distant texts every few weeks. At first, I thought it was just the pace of his new life. I told myself that success had a cost, and maybe that cost was phone calls and Sunday dinners. Then came Meredith. She was elegant in a way I could never be. Tall, poised, with a voice like she'd been trained to give TED Talks. They met at a charity gala and were married within 8 months. I wore a navy blue dress to their wedding and sat 3 rows behind the bride's family. When I rose to speak during the toast, Meredith's mother gently touched my arm and said, "They're trying to keep things moving along, dear. Maybe another time." I smiled and sat down. After the wedding, the visits grew fewer. When they bought a house in the suburbs, Adam gave me the address but asked me to call before dropping by. Meredith had a system for their weekends. I visited once for Thanksgiving. I brought my famous sweet potato casserole, the one Adam always loved as a boy. Meredith barely touched it. "We try to avoid too much sugar," she said with a quick glance at Adam. He didn't look up. Still, I kept hoping that maybe he'd remember who tucked him in through fevers, who stood by the window watching his first bike ride, who worked overtime so he wouldn't miss the school field trip. I kept telling myself that if I just stayed patient, he'd come around. And so, when I got the invitation for Mother's Day brunch this year, my heart stirred with something dangerous: hope. It had been nearly 6 months since I last saw Adam in person. The invitation came via text. "Hey, Mom, we're doing brunch Sunday at Thistle and Vine for Mother's Day. Thought you might want to join. 11 a.m. I reread it 3 times. There were no hearts, no "love you," no mention of the grandkids. But it was something. I spent the evening ironing my nicest blouse and polishing the locket that held a photo of Adam as a toddler. When I arrived at the restaurant, Meredith gave me a nod, like I was a distant colleague, and the children greeted me with awkward hugs, nudged into place by their father's hand. I tried not to let it hurt. I asked about school, hobbies, friends. I got short answers and polite smiles in return. The brunch was beautiful. Plates of eggs, Benedict, fresh fruit, rosemary potatoes. I watched Adam eat, laughing lightly with Meredith about something I couldn't quite hear. He looked content, removed, like a chapter of his life that no longer included me. But I stayed grateful. I told myself, at least we're together. After the meal, Adam reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small white envelope. I thought maybe it was a note, or even, foolishly, a gift card to the bookstore I loved. Inside was a neatly printed receipt from the restaurant. My eyes traced the line items: 4 adults, 2 kids, service charge, tax, and then circled in red ink, $43.27, my share. Underneath, in his handwriting, "We all split equally, Mom. It's only fair." Fair. The word echoed in my ears, dull and cold like a church bell struck by frost. I sat there for a moment, holding the envelope like it might burn a hole through my fingers. I didn't say anything. I looked around the table, searching for a flicker of discomfort, some sign that someone, anyone, thought this was wrong. But there was nothing. The kids were busy with their phones. Meredith was scanning the dessert menu. Adam was tucking his wallet away like this was the most natural thing in the world. So I smiled. It wasn't real, but it was practiced. One of those smiles you wear to funerals or disappointing birthdays. "Thank you," I said, folding the receipt carefully back into the envelope. "That's very clear of you." I stood up slowly, steadying myself against the table. "I think I'll get going. Brunch was lovely." No one protested. No one asked if I needed a ride or if I wanted to spend the afternoon with them. Meredith offered a short wave. Adam gave me a peck on the cheek, his lips brushing my skin like obligation. The door of the restaurant clicked shut behind me, and I stood outside on the curb, feeling the spring wind sting my eyes. Or maybe it was something else. I walked 2 blocks to the nearest bench and sat down. Around me, other families laughed and hugged, mothers holding flowers or handmade cards. I watched them, and something in my chest tightened, not from envy, but from recognition. I used to be that mother. I used to be needed. That day, I learned something unspoken. When they stop needing you, they also stop seeing you. But what they didn't know was that I had not disappeared. I had only been quiet. The Monday after Mother's Day, I woke before dawn and put the kettle on. My little house creaked and stretched in the cool morning air. I moved quietly through the motions, tea leaves, boiling water, the familiar clink of ceramic on wood. But something inside me had changed. I sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from my cup, and looked at the envelope again. I hadn't thrown it away. Not yet. It sat like an accusation, its red circle still bright, still mocking. What hurt most wasn't the bill. It was the precision of it. The decision to divide, to assign value, to draw a line and say, "This is what you owe." It wasn't just a receipt. It was a message. You're not special. You're just another mouth at the table. I let my thoughts spiral. I remembered things, quiet things, painful things. The time Adam broke his wrist at age 7 and I sat up all night with him in the ER. The year I wore the same winter coat with a broken zipper because he needed new cleats for soccer. The night he missed curfew, and I drove through every neighborhood in town until I found him asleep in a friend's basement, too scared to call me. And more recently, how he'd begun calling me Ruth instead of Mom in public. How he joked that I should get a roommate to help with expenses. How he once suggested selling the house because the market's hot and you're not using all that space anyway. The signs had been there. I had just refused to read them. That night, after the dishes were done and the sun had vanished behind the sycamores, I sat in my bedroom and took out my old stationer. The ivory paper with the golden trim had yellowed with age, but it still smelled faintly of lavender from the drawer sachet I kept nearby. I uncapped my pen, the one Harold gave me when Adam was born, and began to write. "Dear Adam," I started, then stopped. This wasn't going to be a letter I'd send. It wasn't even for him. It was for me. A reckoning. A release. So I began again, without a salutation. I remember the winter of '97. You had bronchitis, and I couldn't afford both your antibiotics and heating oil. I chose the medicine. We wore coats inside for 2 weeks. I remember the look on your face when you got your acceptance letter to Michigan. I remember hiding in the pantry and crying, not just from pride, but from fear. I didn't know how I'd pay for it, but I found a way. The pen moved faster than my thoughts. Page after page I poured it out, sacrifices I'd never named, pains I'd never shared, the jobs I took, the proposals I turned down, the birthdays I spent alone so he could be with friends, the things I'd given, freely, joyfully, but that he had never asked about and never thanked me for. At the end, I simply wrote, "I have nothing left to give you that you haven't already taken, except one final gift. You'll receive it soon." I folded the letter and placed it in the old cedar box with my wedding band and Harold's pocket watch. Then I reached for the folder marked Property. 5 years ago, I sold the last piece of land my mother left me, a sloping parcel of pine and granite tucked along the northern coast of Maine. It wasn't large, but it had been in our family for 3 generations. I used the money to buy something I had never told anyone about. A condo, a modest 1-bedroom unit in Oceanside, California. It faced east, and on clear mornings the sun would spill through the balcony and across the hardwood floors like melted gold. I'd found it on a whim, after a winter when my arthritis left me barely able to move. I told the agent I needed a place where my body could breathe again. She told me I'd chosen well. The deed was in my name only. No co-signers, no strings, just me. I visited it once a year, alone. I furnished it slowly. Nothing lavish, but everything chosen with care. A bookshelf with only my favorite titles, a rocking chair that didn't squeak, a kettle exactly like the one Harold used. I never told Adam. I never told anyone. It wasn't a secret out of shame. It was something else, an act of preservation, a sanctuary I built in silence, like a safety net only I knew was there. Now it was time. That night, I took out my savings passbook and checked the balance. Between the leftover insurance money, my careful budgeting, and my Social Security, it was enough. Enough to live, not lavishly but peacefully, independently. I went to bed with my suitcase open on the bench, not packed yet, but waiting. I knew what came next. The final conversation. A week later, I called Adam and asked if I could stop by. He sounded surprised, hesitant even, but agreed. Sure, Mom. Meredith has a thing, so it'll just be me and the kids, but yeah, come by. I didn't bring cookies or a casserole. I brought a small manila folder and a box wrapped in silver paper. Inside the box was a card I had made myself, ivory cardstock, my old fountain pen, and a very specific message. When I arrived, the house was filled with the sounds of a television somewhere in the back. The children offered distracted waves. Adam looked up from his laptop, standing in that half-hearted way people do when they're not sure how long you plan to stay. Hey, Mom, everything okay? I won't be long, I said gently, and sat across from him at the kitchen island. I slid the manila folder toward him. I wanted to leave you with something. Just one more Mother's Day gift. It's a little late, but it's thoughtful. He opened it, eyes narrowing as he pulled out the single sheet inside. It was a handwritten ledger, rows and rows of items, dates, costs, diapers, formula, pediatric visits, piano lessons, high school uniforms, braces, summer camp, college tuition, graduation suit. At the bottom, the total, $1,167,982.75 payable in gratitude. Adam stared at the page, his face slack. His mouth opened, then closed again. Before he could speak, I slid the silver box toward him. Inside was the receipt from Brunch, now framed in glass. Beneath it, in calligraphy, "It's only fair, right?" I smiled. I thought you'd appreciate the symmetry. Adam didn't say anything for a long time. His hand remained on the invoice, fingers curled slightly, as if unsure whether to crumple it or clutch it. "I didn't mean to," he began. I raised my hand gently. "I know. That's the thing, Adam. You didn't mean to hurt me, but you didn't mean not to either." He looked away. I stood, smoothing the front of my coat. "You don't owe me anything, and," I said, "this isn't about money. It never was. But it seems numbers are how you make sense of things now. So I thought I'd speak in your language." He was silent, his eyes fixed on the paper as though it might rearrange itself into something easier to bear. At the door, I paused. "I'm moving," I said. "I've found a place by the coast. I won't be far if you, or the kids, ever want to visit, but I won't be waiting." That got his attention. He looked up, startled. "Moving?" "Yes, I've got a small condo. It's quiet. It's mine, and the morning sun hits just right." He nodded slowly. Is this because of Brunch?" I smiled, not unkindly. "No, sweetheart. That was just the receipt." And then I left. I walked down the front steps, past the tulips Meredith had planted, and toward the street. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lilac. It reminded me of Harold, of beginnings, of closing a door without slamming it. And for the first time in years, I felt weightless, not because I had given something up, but because I had taken something back. Myself. I moved to Oceanside on a Monday. The sun greeted me like an old friend, warm, honest, and steady. The air was filled with salt and eucalyptus. I arrived with 2 suitcases, a cedar box, and a heart surprisingly free of heaviness. The condo was exactly as I remembered it, modest, sunlit, and quiet. The sliding glass doors opened to a balcony that overlooked a small courtyard full of hummingbirds and bougainvillea. No one slammed doors. No televisions blared. Just the rhythm of the ocean and the occasional soft whistle of wind brushing past the stucco. I unpacked slowly. Each item I placed felt like a declaration. This was mine, not inherited, not borrowed, not gifted with caveats or strings. The chipped teacup, the threadbare quilt, the photographs I had carried across half a country. They belonged here, with me, in this next chapter. The first evening, I sat on the balcony with a book and a glass of water, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone's mother or someone's widow. I felt like Ruth. On the third day, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find a woman about my age with silver-streaked curls and a canvas tote that read, "Retired, but dangerous." "You must be the new tenant," she said with a grin. "I'm Dolores, Unit 2B. I brought lemonade. Hope you're not one of those no-sugar types." I laughed, something I hadn't done in a while. Only when it comes to memories. She smiled wider. "Then we'll get along just fine." We sat on the balcony and talked for hours. Dolores had been a high school English teacher for 37 years. Her daughter had married a man she called a very polished bulldozer, and after too many holidays filled with forced smiles and silent treatment, Dolores had packed her bags and left. We understood each other without needing to explain too much. That night, I slept without dreams. A few weeks into my new life, I began to write, not just lists or letters or daily notes, but real writing. Pages and pages of memories, stitched together like a quilt. I wrote about Harold and his flannel shirts. I wrote about Adam building forts with couch cushions. I wrote about the years I had spent invisible and the decision to make myself whole again. I didn't know if it would become a memoir, or a private journal, or simply a stack of papers to be boxed and forgotten. It didn't matter. The act of writing was enough. It was the stitching of identity, a reclaiming. Dolores encouraged me. She brought over her dusty royal typewriter and declared Wednesday mornings our memoir hour. She'd bring strong coffee, I'd make scones, and we would write side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes between fits of laughter or quiet tears. Then, one morning, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope addressed in crooked, uneven handwriting. There was no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and it smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Grandma, I found your old storybook in the attic. It still smells like cinnamon. I miss you. Love, Ellie." I pressed the note to my chest and let the tears come, soft and steady, not out of grief, but recognition. Ellie was the youngest, the quietest, the one who never spoke unless spoken to. I had assumed I'd faded from her world, erased by the slow indifference of her parents. But I was wrong. She had remembered. She had seen me, and what she saw was enough. A few days later, another letter came. This one included a photo, one I hadn't seen in years. Adam, age 5, sat on my lap at the kitchen table, a slice of chocolate cake smeared across his cheek, a candle still flickering in front of him. My hand was resting gently on his back. We were both laughing. Ellie wrote, "Dad said you used to read to him from the big storybook. I found it. I read it to myself when I can't sleep. I think I want to be a writer, too. P.S. I'm keeping this photo in my desk drawer at school." I framed the picture and placed it by the window, where the morning sun would find it each day, and I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. I had been enough, as a mother, as a woman, as a person. And somehow, that truth had survived, not in the son who forgot, but in the granddaughter who remembered. That was legacy. That was love. Not loud, not perfect, but real. On the morning of my 74th birthday, Dolores showed up at my door with a picnic basket and 2 beach towels. "We're not old," she said. "We're just experienced." We walked together to the shore and found a spot near the dunes. The tide was low and the horizon so clear it looked painted. Dolores handed me a small parcel wrapped in linen. Inside was a pen, wooden, hand-carved, warm in the palm. "For the next chapter," she said. I held it and thought about all the chapters behind me, the ones written in sacrifice, in silence, in love. And now this one, not born from pain, but from peace. That evening I lit a candle and placed it on a slice of lemon cake. I made a wish, not for reconciliation or apology, but for continuity, that the good I had sown might grow wherever it landed, in whatever form it took, whether in Ellie's hands or the kindness of a stranger. Before bed, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. Healing doesn't always mean returning. Sometimes it means arriving. And when I turned out the light, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt free. Not all stories end in reunion. Some end in rediscovery. And mine, at last, had become my own. People say Mother's Day is about flowers. Maybe. But I've learned it's also about roots. And sometimes, letting go is what lets the tree grow again.